Hello and welcome back to Ride Rescue. In the last episode of the Pontiac build, I did the fender that had the mangled bottom end and the big rust hole. And this one I'll do the opposite side. I went ahead and patched in the small patch. It was just a little rectangular area that needed to be welded in. And then I'll go on to do the rest of the dents and the waves and the rust on this fender. Now that's how you do a rust hole patch. I ground the whole area down to get all the paint finish off and any possible rust underneath the finish. It gives me a good bonding surface for the filler. So back on the point of what is it that we're wanting to accomplish with this car and what finish. Preferably, I would have liked to have kept as much of this original paint as I could. But this fender was pretty rough, obviously with the rust, but also with the forklift damage from when it was picked up sideways. There's some rippling in this area that once I tool it out, I'm real comfortable with how smooth it is now, but it's going to need a little bit of skim coat of filler to really flatten it out. You can see in the light a little bit of hammer marks. I could keep working that, but it's never going to be to perfection other than having to put in a pretty heavy coat of primer. And that we could do. When it comes to metal finishing, if I was to put a real heavy coat of primer surfacer on this fender, I could smooth it out without putting any filler. I prefer doing a skim coat of filler, and then I can block it with a long board and then just do a primer surfacer to fill any pinholes and scratches. But as I'm sanding this, then it brings up the point of how much of the paint do we remove. A lot of guys will strip it completely. They'll dip them, or they'll just sand it all down, or even media blast it, water blast it. What I want on this car is I want to see some of the original tooling marks. And those original tool marks that will be showing up, there's some peaks and lows. We got some little valleys in here, and we got some high spots. I could work those, but that's the way the car came. And I don't want to take this to a high-end show car and have everything perfectly finished. A lot of what I'm doing with this car, it's going to have flaws. It's got some runs in the paint in the engine bay, on the underside of the hood, and on the underside of the trunk. That's the way these cars came. So since this car has only had one factory paint job, it has never been painted other than some touch-up work on one front fender. So I don't really need to take all this paint off. But as you can see in some of these areas, as I'm sanding this down, you can see some rust areas that have gotten little pinholes, and there's been rust that's creeped through. So as I sand this off, these little marks are where the rust has gotten behind the paint. So in those areas, we'll definitely want to sand to the point of cleaning that rust, but I don't need to take it all off. In this valley, there was a lot of heavy paint as the paint built in the spraying process. I don't need to take all of this paint out. It's solid, there's no rust, it's smooth. So these areas though, I'm going to have to sand this down to bare metal. Yeah, I could blast it, but sandblasting, I know some guys that have gotten carried away, and they've worked and stretched panels to the point where they're not even savable. It's just too much work to bring them back and get them flat. So I will just sand this to the point where I'm comfortable, and pretty much to this area here. I think I've gotten through the finish to the point of having a good solid shiny metal, no rust to have to worry about, with a good coat of epoxy primer. I'm very comfortable about a good solid bond and not having any rust come back. You can see this, there was a fairly good dent here. There was a pretty good dent here. I've tooled that as much as I can. I'm worried if I keep working it, I'm going to crack it. So that will be a skim coat of filler, and I'll be able to keep working that without fatiguing the metal any more than I have to. So it's coming out excellent, way better than I had thought. I was worried about this fender, whether or not I could even save it. I didn't want to have to go find another one because I know I'll just end up with another rusty fender. It's pretty hard to find a fender for a 1960 Pontiac that doesn't have rust. And on the top seam, where it meets up with the hood on these cars, are notorious for splitting because the fender well doesn't come all the way to the inside. When that rusts and splits, that is a lot of work to put that back together and have it look factory original. I'm excited. It's working out great. We'll move on to the next fender. I'm standing on the top of this fender, and I was excited at what a great bond and good paint there was on the top until I got to this area over by where it meets up to the windshield. Obviously there's a bare patch that was going to have to be dealt with, but as you can see, the bubbles and the blisters, that's rust underneath the paint. So that is going to have to be taken down. You can see in this area I've taken it all the way down to bare metal, and it's cleaning up really good, so not too much to be concerned with. I don't need to sandblast it. Might be a little bit of wire brushing. Could use a wire wheel to clean it up. But I'm back on this panel. Getting back to this panel, now that this area is smoothed out and the welds have been ground down, I want to flatten this panel out as much as possible. So I'll use a long straight edge, and you can see, I can see that there is a little bit of a high spot right here, and it's low here. Once it's made it up to the door, I don't want the light to catch that low spot and this high spot. So if I line this up, I've got a rise. And as I move around this panel, I'm good up here, but where this lead has been put in, where this has been repaired many, many years ago, there's a dip in the middle of this fender that's a good 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. So I need to bring this up too. On this side of the fender, it's pretty slight. There's maybe not even 1/8 of an inch. So this fender well has been pushed in. When the trim is on there, it probably wouldn't be that noticeable, but there's a chance that it would be, and I don't want to take that chance. And there it is. Let's go back along. I made this flip all wavy now. Just perfect. Well, just need to clean up this lead area. On the bottom of this channel has got some pretty good rust pits and flakes that need to be cleaned up. So this area was much worse than I thought when it comes to the rust. The rust was deeply embedded in the surface. Grinding and sanding just wasn't cutting it. I had to scrape it with a chisel to get down deep, and luckily this fender is heavy gauge, A normal fender, it would have just eaten right through. But there's still good solid metal there. I'm going to put some rust remover goop on that and get all the way down into those crevices and make sure that I can prevent this from coming back. So I'm going to use this navel jelly rust remover. I like this product because it stays wet for a very long period of time, and being able to get it down into this crevice, it's a very good product for these deep grooves that the rust has dug and embedded itself deep into, or has corroded deep into the metal. We'll leave that on to set. May take an hour, maybe even more. We'll keep checking back on it and make sure that that's eating all the way down into those deep grooves. So while that navel jelly is doing its job, I'll get back to leveling out this panel. Working on this area, trying to level it out. What I've got is I've got a high spot here, and I bring this area down flat where I want it. I'm creating a wave where I'm up and down, and then I move from this side and I'm back over. All I'm doing is moving it back and forth, and the more I move it back and forth, the more this panel is starting to stretch. So I got to the point where this area is oil canning. And when it oil cans, there's really nothing you can do but to shrink the metal. There's several ways of shrinking the metal. There's the shrinking hammer and a shrinking slap pad that is a waffle finish. And that waffle finish, as you're tapping it, it'll scrunch and pull the metal together. It leaves a pretty rough finish, but it's pretty effective. I don't have that hammer. I can't seem to find it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a shrinking method with a torch. We're going to heat it up and then cool it after tapping it down, and that will shrink it up. I've done a little bit here experimenting to make sure it would work for me, and it's been working very well. So I still have a few more areas here. I've got an area here that's high, an area here that's high, and an area here that's high, that when I tap it down, it just pops up somewhere else. So now I'm popping up here. So I'll show you how to work that. The matte gas is a little bit hotter, so I prefer that. It's a little bit more expensive, but it does a really good job. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat it up in circles. As it gets hot, you'll see the metal is actually stretching and it's growing first few times you do this, it was kind of scary because it appears as though you're just making it worse. This is raised up considerably now. Once they get it hot, you can see it start to turn red. I'm going to tap it down, and then I like to just use a wet towel and then cool it. Now that area is down. So I have another area right here. I'll do the same. One more right here. Still have a little bit of a high spot right here. I will hit that one. Rather than trying to tap it down while I have the torch out, I'll shrink that area as well. There you have it. Let's double check. We've got a little bit of a high spot right here, but a little bit of a low spot here, and a little bit of a low spot here. I should be able to work this and not have to worry about any more stretching or shrinking. But now that you can see how to do it, you can feel confident that if you do end up with an area that's stretched, you can just heat up the spot, bump it down, cool it off, and then go back to tapping. Inside this trim area, just above the wheel well where all the lead is, in the bottom of this valley, the rust had really gone in deep. Luckily, the gauge of this metal is pretty thick, so where the pits got really deep, the navel jelly was able to work those pits perfectly clean. With the little wire brush, I was able to clean out all the residue on the base of that. Now I'll be able to go back in and use some filler, some plastic filler to fill all those little pits, as well as to reshape and recontour this valley where the trim goes in. That valley, when it was damaged years ago when this was leaded, is too wide in this area, but I really don't want to work it because it keeps moving this fender well lips. We're going to leave it the way it is now, and the filler is not going to be very thick to get that contour back. It's only going to be probably a 1/16 of an inch on each side, so that's well within the manufacturer's specifications of the filler. And now that I've got some really good grind and some good clean surface metal, it will bond well, and I shouldn't have any problems in the future of this car. It's looking really good, getting excited. Should be smoothing on some filler on these panels and getting them primed here pretty quick, and then it's ready for paint. So as I'm sanding this fender, what I'm looking for is any little fine cracks or blisters in the paint to decide whether or not I'm going to take this fender all the way down to bare metal. I was really happy with the original paint until I get to the top of this panel. This area, like the other one, has got a lot of little fine rust. I'm going to have to take this all down to bare metal. But as I get into this area, just up from where the lead is plastic filler. And this plastic filler has got some fine cracks in it, and what I'm finding as I'm sanding is that filler is actually lifting. So, and then there is a big rust area right there too, where moisture has gotten underneath the primer next to the filler. So back in the 60s, I wouldn't fix this fender. I would have given up on it. I would have tossed it and bought another one. Go to the dealer and buy a new fender. This has had a lot of work done over the years. Obviously the lead that's in here, this fender was fixed probably in the 60s, but I don't have an option to go buy another fender, so we're going to keep working on this one. We'll take this all down to bare metal, and I'll fix it. You can see there's some high points that have popped up in my sanding. There's a pretty good low point right here, and then there is this rust. It looks like there's some high points in this area too, and another low point. So I've got my work cut out for me, but it's a solid fender now. There's no rust, so it's worth saving. It's just going to be a lot of hours, and hours leads to money. But when you're a do-it-yourselfer and you're on a budget, these are the kind of things you can save. So just as I expected, this whole area was just a fine coating of rust underneath all that paint. From the surface, you could just see fine little weather check marks, but under the surface, it was just a solid film of rust. This area is where that filler was. It's a little ripply, and there's a few high spots and low spots, but the filler was cracked all the way through. There was some surface rust underneath the filler, so it was good to get all that out. For long straight lines, I like to use a straight edge to verify, because especially on the side of a panel, if you look down with a shiny surface, you're going to see any waves, and you often hear that at car shows. You look down the side of a car and it's just full of waves. Now, in a curved surface, you can't really tell for sure if you've got a high spot or a low spot. If I find a flat spot where it should be curved, then it's obvious, but it's difficult to tell with a straight edge. Now, what I like to do is use something, this square is fairly heavy metal. For drastic curves, I like to use a lighter metal like a ruler, a flexible ruler. This is fairly thick, and so it works really well for checking contours of a curve. So if I put pressure on both ends, and I'm able to look across that surface, and I can see I've got good smooth contact all the way. If there was a drastic low spot here, it would be obvious because there would be a bridge that goes up across the top of that. So I can see a little bit of a dent there, but when it comes to the overall contours of this panel, the person that did the patch or the filler on this area years past did a really good job getting the contours correct, and then just putting the skin coat of filler on that. So looks like I'll be able to get away with just doing the same thing. fender was hit, it must have took a pretty good impact that pushed the fender well in to the inside lip of this fender as well. This inner lip, it's bowed. And there's two bumpers on this fender that the bumpers were heavily smashed, and the hood alignment has a slight bow where there's gaps at the front and the back, and it's very tight here in the middle. So I'm going to bring this in too, and it's pretty obvious with the straight edge that that is a huge bow. Yes, I think what I'll attempt is to use my clamps and to use my straight edge. I'll run along that surface because I'm about 3/4 of an inch bow in the middle of this, so it's pretty drastic. I'm pretty confident that if I clamp this down and then just tap this edge, I should be able to line it back up. Oh, you can see this transition. That should be a straight line. And when I tried to test fit the fender on the fender well, this was pretty difficult to get to sync up. So we'll pull that in and get that straight. Probably not the best use of a level, and most likely will mess up my level in the future, but sometimes you have to sacrifice a tool to save a fender. And by working this surface back and forth, it will take some of that memory out of this bend. Let's see how we did. That's a beautiful thing. First try. Fantastic. Alright, so I want to start with putting filler along the top edge of this fender. I sanded this with 180 on my DA, and it doesn't quite have enough bite to it in some of these primer areas, so I'm going to sand it with an 80 grit, so I'm comfortable with that. Great. Done. So thank you for watching this episode. I really appreciate it. Give me a like if you like what I'm doing. Press that subscribe button. Any subscriptions helps me to be able to grow and keep bringing on more content. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you again.